So hello again. I am Kevin Pugh,
I'm Cassie Bergstrom.
and this is our second motivation vlog that we're doing for our online master students. And this one's going to be on self-determination theory and interest. Um, um, but first, you know, again, like last time, we chose some virtual backgrounds so you can try to guess where we are. So, you know, here's mine. There's
There's
Cassie's.
mine.
So start guessing. All right, so Cassie, you have a story for us today. Do you want to
Yes,
share your story with us?
I've got the story of my own high school cross country experience. So I ran cross country for 3 years in high school, and I had one coach for the first 2 years and a different coach for the last year, my senior year. And the approach of these coaches was very different. So our first coach was very into creating a lifelong love of running. So he really had us set our own goals and supported us in setting our own goals. He even like would verbalize, he would tell us, it's okay if you are not running at the front of the pack. As long as you're improving, you're walking less and running more. That was one thing he would always say. But really try to instill this love of running in us. And we did things even like we did some like mentalized, like kind of almost meditation, but visualization practice about, how you're going to kick at the end of the run. And we'd replay this. It was a very supportive environment. Our coach worked intentionally to build community. We had dinners before our cross country meets, like pancake feeds or spaghetti feeds, the carb loading. We focused on improving on our own successes. So we each kept a journal so that we could see how we had done. He had to leave after my junior year. Although our team had great success that year, we were highly motivated. We won regionals. It was the only time personally I ever went to regionals, so it was a good year for me. Then we got another coach. So our first coach had to take on a different position at his job, and he had no longer had time to coach us. The second coach he had gone to state and cross country himself and was very focused on winning. Was really the only focus was on winning. And he would plan only where he had both the boys and girls cross country teams that would run together, but he would only plan workouts for the boys. And so it was basically up to me and my friend, who were both the senior girls, to plan out these workouts for the girls. He focused a lot on finishing position. So in cross country, your score as a team is made up of basically adding together the different positions. So first or third or fifth position, fifth place at the end. And so he was really focused on this positioning. So saying that we really need to make sure that your position is good. So as opposed to self-improvement or keeping track of our own times, he was really focused on winning in that position. The result was a lot of our team lost motivation that year, particularly the girls. We lost motivation and interest in running, kind of started ganging up on the coach. And then the coach tended to focus on this conflict instead of actually, and we as runners focused on the conflict instead of becoming better also. Well, I see these two experiences as really different, particularly in what types of conditions they were setting up to increase intrinsic motivation. So this just love of running, or running because you enjoy it instead of running because someone else, is kind of controlling you or forcing you to do so. That motivational climate was different. Autonomy is one of these things in terms of feeling like you have a choice. Under the first coach, we felt like we had, that we had a choice, that we had, some kind of different levels of how he defined success, as opposed to the second coach defined success in one way, finishing position. The first coach, with different activities outside of the practice, really tried to build relatedness within our community, to create a community of runners. The second kind of divided us because he had different things for the boys and the girls, and it really was not coherent. And the third one, if we look at how confident we felt. When we take a more holistic approach and with the first coach really trying to love running and running for life, becoming a lifelong runner, that kind of made us feel more confident that we, regardless of how we did, if we were improving on our own goals, we were succeeding. As opposed to the second coach, really, if you didn't meet his goals, then it was not considered success. So, you didn't feel very confident or competent in our own abilities. So when I was thinking about a story to really illustrate, the difference between, kind of intrinsic and extrinsic types of motivation, really looking at those things that we can do in environments to help foster intrinsic motivation. I see my first coach in cross country is really doing that. And the second coach is very much not doing that. And I don't think I should speak to, I'm not currently much of a runner. So I suppose if we would have ended with the first coach, maybe I would have had more motivation to continue running. But it was a stark difference in the feeling of those different years as well. So
Yeah.
yes.
So, thanks, Cassie. So,
Oh
so,
yes.
so self-determination theory is, this theory, a large set of research that's all centered on these issues of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And as you can tell from the name of the theory, the value is on the intrinsic motivation.
Mhm.
And the reason why, is because it turns out, there's some real value, some real benefits to fostering more intrinsic kinds of motivation. And your story is a great example of that, of some of the differences, but we'll kind of run through these. And as they relate to education, because we see these things carry over. So, one of the benefits of intrinsic motivation is that it tends to lead to better learning outcomes overall. So like in education, when students are more intrinsically motivated, or when you help them develop an interest in the content or in the course, in the class, um, then what we see is students naturally adopt more deeper level learning strategies. They're more likely to focus on connecting the content to things they already know or experiences in their everyday lives. They're more likely to do deep level processing things in terms of like elaborating on the content. So, again, making connections, but also, deepening the understanding within that. In many ways, understanding is about just making more connections and that. But and so this deeper learning is something we see associated with intrinsic motivation. What else do
Yeah.
we see?
Yeah, so another benefit, something else we see with intrinsic motivation is persistence and re-engagement. So it's this idea that if we are intrinsically motivated to complete a task, we're more likely to persist through challenges that we might face. And we're also more likely to re-engage in that task after, it might be that we do a homework assignment on something and we find it so interesting, we're so intrinsically motivated in that we decided to investigate that idea more on our own, maybe outside of school or at home. And so reading is an example of this as well. We know that particularly with the intrinsic motivation, if we have kids who are intrinsically motivated, we tend to see those kids be more likely to increase their vocabulary, more likely to read outside of school, during summers, and into a whole bunch of different, uh, different contexts, and maybe even reading a whole bunch of different things, and that increases their reading skills, as opposed to kids who read for extrinsic incentives or rewards. They will develop, and they may develop some reading skills, but it's not quite the same quality of reading skills as we see with those kids who are really intrinsically motivated to read.
Yeah. And related to that, with intrinsic motivation, um, it's more aligned with developing self-directed learners. So as
Mhm.
motivational researchers, what one issue we often bring up is there's a difference between like motivation and control. There's a difference between motivating students and just controlling the students. Um, and intrinsic motivation is on that side of motivation, that it's getting the students to take responsibility for their own learning and to self-engage. Um, Whereas extrinsic motivation is more about just controlling them to do what we want in that moment. But it's kind of like, like your coach is a great example. The first coach is a great example where was focused on get you to be lifelong runners, and that's creating this more self-directed sort of thing, and that should be a goal of education too. Like we don't want students just to learn what we want them to learn in that class, but wouldn't it be great if we could get them to be these self-directed learners who are learning, engaging throughout their whole lives. So,
Yeah, and that whole life, lifelong spectrum really kind of plays into one of the other benefits, which is looking at well-being. So broadly, even outside of the education spectrum, if we look at adults who are intrinsically motivated, we know that if we are kind of just generally more intrinsically motivated in life, and if our goals that we hold in life are more intrinsic, that we're doing these things because we're taking on jobs or developing hobbies because we really enjoy them, that those individuals tend to report higher levels of well-being. So things like happiness, physical health as well. Mental health as well, that the sense of well-being is definitely more supported when we pursuing things that we are more intrinsically motivated to do. So lots of benefits.
yes. So, and that leads to the question of like, all right, well, what are the conditions under which intrinsic motivation flourishes? How do we support this? And Cassie alluded to this in, her story, that there's, according to self-determination theory, there's really three foundational things, and they refer to these as these three basic psychological needs. And they're a sense of autonomy, sense of competence, and sense of relatedness. And what we find is when we're in a situation where we experience all three of those, we're much more likely to be intrinsically motivated. So, as you can guess from my virtual background, one of the things I'm intrinsically motivated to do is to go skiing, particularly backcountry skiing, which can give you a hint as to where this is. And one of the reasons why is because it meets these three basic psychological needs. So there's a sense of autonomy. So autonomy, is a sense of choice and ownership. Well, I can choose when I go, where I go, how long I go, and there's just a lot of autonomy to it. Um, Sense of competence. I've been doing it long enough that I can do it reasonably well, and so I can feel competent when I do it. But competence is also can just be like in learning and improving, and that so like my son, has started backcountry skiing with me the last number of years, and I don't get any better in a year, but he gets better every year, and that's part of enjoyment for him. Is each time he goes, he gets better. For me now, it's just like just make it up the mountain is a sense of confidence for me. And then his relatedness is, so a sense of belonging and that. So I get to do it with other people I like. And relatedness can also be like a sense of belonging or connection to nature too, which is something I enjoy about, particularly about backcountry skiing. Feel like you're there where you belong, have this connection to nature, and so on. So these apply to education as well. So, in education, a sense of autonomy is a sense of choice and ownership and control over the learning. Um, that I have some choice in what we do or how we do it. I have some control of my learning goals and that sort of thing. Um, and so as a teacher, there's a lot of things we can do to create the conditions for autonomy. We can provide our students with meaningful choices. We can allow them more flexibility in how they do and accomplish things rather than things being really regimented where they don't have much meaningful choice. We can give them, like meaningful responsibility over projects, and that gives them a sense of autonomy as well. And then it's partly their perception too, and helping them, adopt and sort of take that ownership and see it. And so I have a story that relates to this. Uh, the uh, and the sort of the power of a sense of autonomy. So just a couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were with our daughter, 9-year-old daughter, and we were was watching. It was a church-related presentation thing where one of the leaders was talking about this program that they have for children and youth, and it's about setting goals in 4 different areas, like uh, intellectual goals, social goals, physical goals, and spiritual goals. So the idea is you set your own goals in these different areas, and then you work with them. Um, and this leader was saying, our goal of this, our point is that it can be like a support to the children and youth for them to be able to uh, pursue their own goals. But sometimes we feel like they see it as more like a bag of rocks, like this burden they have to carry around and do. And both my wife and I, we look over to our daughter. She looks back at us and says, "Bag of rocks." And we gotta laugh. And then the funny thing is, like, so she says this. What does she do the rest of the day? Well, she spends the whole day doing this Tinker Crate, um, which is so it's a company. They send up these boxes, and then they're things you create, like everything from working headphones to like a little mini projector. I think this one was a lock box. I mean, like there's amazing things. They're these little science kits, they're just great. So she spends most of the day doing that. And then after she completes it, then she goes and gathers materials from her room and creates her own self-created lockbox out of just things lying around. Like these are all these things that could be perfectly fit within intellectual goals in there. She reads all the time. Again, that's the sort of thing that could fit within intellectual goals. There's an elderly widow next to us who our daughter has befriended, and she goes and visits her all the time and takes her cards, takes her things for holidays, and like those are the things that are like be perfect for social goals, and she loves gymnastics and other physical things, and um loves to read the scriptures and that, so like she does all the things that are in these different boxes. But once you say here's a program, and you know set goals for this program, then she sees it as this sort of extrinsic thing, and it goes from being something intrinsic that she loves doing all the time to this bag of rocks. And so with her, it's a lot of her perception, because it's not, the program isn't set up in a really controlling way. Unlike, I see a lot of the things she's asked to do with school, and it's everything, it's just done in a really controlling way. But this one has quite a bit of autonomy to it, but she still doesn't perceive it that way. And so we're working on, helping her say, like, no, think of this as just your own program. Take ownership of this. No one's making you do it. No one's going to give you a bad grade or anything if you don't do anything, just um and so this sense of autonomy, it makes such a difference in the way we orient ourselves, and motivate ourselves to do things. And so we can't fully control this as teachers, but we can try to do things to help our students have more of a sense of autonomy. And as they have more of a sense of autonomy, they're likely to be more intrinsically motivated and reap all these benefits that we mentioned before. So that's a little bit on autonomy. Cassie, do you want to talk to us about sense of competence?
Yeah, so sense of competence, kind of similar to what you were just talking about, Kevin, in terms of the perception being important. With a sense of competence, it's basically the feeling that I am able, I know that I am able to succeed at this task that I'm trying to do. So when we have a higher sense of competence, we feel more confident in our ability to succeed at those tasks. And again, there's a perception element here that there's things that we can do as teachers to set up an environment to increase competence. Um, But, individual kiddos are going to have different levels of competence coming into our classrooms. But things that we can do to set up, an area that focuses on competence. Even looking back at my cross country, the coach that had us set our own goals, and then the goal was basically, and he voiced the goal was basically to improve on your own times. That alone is a good way. So improving on your past successes and failures, so connecting your own success to your own past performance can be one way to increase competence. Also making sure that we are developing assignments and activities for students to do that kind of fit in that zone of proximal development, essentially. So making sure that these are tasks that are not too easy for students, but also that they're not so difficult that it's really going to cause a lot of frustration. If we can hit that nice middle ground for activities and assignments that meet the skill level of our students, right on, then that really increases the likelihood that competence will develop as well. We're able to, successfully complete not easy tasks, but things that really are within our ability to succeed at. So competence, again, if we have higher levels of competence, we're more likely to feel intrinsically motivated to complete tasks. So the third one is relatedness. Go
Yeah.
back to Kevin.
And then I was just going to mention, like in one of our future blogs, we'll talk specifically about some of the, these theories of competency beliefs, because
Mhm.
that's a whole perspective itself, and things like how do you foster self-efficacy? What do you do with students who have learned helplessness and
Yep.
all that? So we'll talk a lot more about those same sort of things.
Yep.
And yeah, so relatedness. So in the classroom, this is like having a sense of belonging, and a sense of connection to other people there. So when students feel like they belong in the classroom, they feel like they're part of a community, they have a relationship, a positive relationship with the teacher and with other students, or at least with one good friend. It turns out it's really surprising how much of a difference having one good friend makes in terms of um, all this stuff. So that sense of relatedness again makes it more likely that students will be intrinsically motivated in that environment. On the other hand, if they feel like they don't really belong and that, then they're just unlikely to be intrinsically motivated. So yeah, so those are the three basic psychological needs.
Yep. And additionally, kind of considering this idea that true intrinsic motivation requires some inherent satisfaction too. When we are really, when you think about the things that you're really intrinsically motivated to do, that you just do them because you love them, that feeling of satisfaction is really motivating itself. It can kind of help self-sustain
Yeah,
that
so it's like
intrinsic
with the
motivation.
sorry, I was gonna
No,
say,
go for it.
like with the skiing, so there's a sense of autonomy and competence and relatedness. But then there's also times where it just feels really good to ski down through powder. I mean, there's just something inherently awesome about
Inherent satisfaction. And
that.
so, from a school's perspective, what you can do in your classroom, try to think about what is inherently satisfying about the content that you teach. So, what is it that you're teaching, and what just really, what is really satisfying about that content beyond these ideas of autonomy and competence and relatedness? With the idea being that if we recognize what is inherently satisfying, we're more likely to kind of help our students see what is inherently satisfying in that content as well. So helping students recognize this and develop skills that are related to related to the content, but skills that you can kind of seat within a context of being inherently satisfying themselves. So you just love to do it, and even modeling that and expressing that to your students can be really beneficial. This is why I love this stuff. This is why it's so interesting to me. That kind of conveys that inherent satisfaction.
Yeah. So, to get them to experience that satisfying feeling, sense that comes from learning an interesting idea, developing a new skill, and that, yeah, don't discount that. That's
Don't discount it. I agree.
all right. So one of the questions, no, probably the most common question that we get all the time when, as part of, this discussion of intrinsic, extrinsic motivation and self-determination theory and all that, is this question of rewards. Are rewards good or evil? Do rewards undermine intrinsic motivation, or do they foster intrinsic motivation? And there's been a lot of research on this, and there's different ideas. People, will have different opinions about this, but we thought we would talk about this a little bit. So, Cassie, why don't you start us off and talk a little bit about the original research on how extrinsic motivation can undermine intrinsic motivation?
Yeah, so I feel like a lot of the original research also saw these as very, two separate things, that you had to be either extrinsically motivated or intrinsically motivated, and that it was kind of like a switch that flipped. So a lot of the original research looked at individuals who did tasks that were intrinsically motivating, originally intrinsically motivating, and then had some extrinsic incentive put onto that task. So maybe, they start getting paid, or they start, maybe they're doing it for a grade, these extrinsic type of tasks. And what they found was that once that extrinsic motivation, or once that extrinsic incentive was added, intrinsic motivation tended to decline. So they call this the undermining effect, that essentially that extrinsic reward or incentive was undermining that intrinsic motivation. And so, going forward, they found that that motivation would be lower. So some of
So like
the,
the child in kindergarten enjoys drawing pictures. The teacher starts giving them rewards, certificates for each picture they draw. And then you find out during free time, they might start drawing less pictures after they've been rewarded for doing this thing that they were doing just for their own sake before.
yeah, and I'm sure you can think about even these examples in your own life, things that you did because you just enjoyed doing them, then maybe you got a job related to that or something, and it kind of decreases that intrinsic motivation and that enjoyment. So, kind of thinking along, that was some of the original research. Since then, the research has gotten a little bit more specific, and looking at this from not just so much as either intrinsically motivated or extrinsically motivated, but looking at how do students perceive those different conditions. So that leads to one of our key questions.
Yeah. Um, the so this research then led to, like some researchers saying, oh, so teachers should never use rewards because they're always going to be undermining intrinsic motivation. Other people are saying, no, it's not a big different issue because, kids aren't intrinsically motivated to begin with. They hate school. You aren't undermining anything. Um, so as we've done a bunch more research, we've learned a lot more. The results are more nuanced than rewards are good or evil, and we'll try to talk a little bit about that. I think one overarching thing to keep in mind is that the research tends to find that some sort of extrinsic motivation, like a reward or a punishment, it's more likely to undermine intrinsic motivation when it's perceived as being controlling or manipulative way, like the reward is. Like if I see that I'm being given this reward in order to try to control or manipulate my behavior, that's when it's more likely to undermine my intrinsic motivation. And so there are certain conditions under which rewards do that or not. So Cassie, do you want to talk about some
Yeah.
of those?
So I've got the first one there. So one of the conditions is if we have tangible predetermined rewards. So if we know going in that there's this, this thing that we are going to get if we meet whatever criteria, that those tangible predetermined rewards are most likely to undermine intrinsic motivation. Compared to things like praise or spontaneous rewards, those are less likely to undermine intrinsic motivation. So an example of this, I have a friend who has a kiddo in fourth grade, and she decided that it was really important for for her at least, to pay her child for grades after, at the end of the semester. And so she had posted on Facebook and she said, I feel like this is kind of blowing up in my face because now he's not focused on bringing up the few classes that he has that are B's. I think she was going to pay him like $20 if he got all A's. It's like he's not focused on, doing better in those classes. He's more focused on arguing with me about what constitutes an A. And so, again, that focus switched from being focused on the learning to being focused on that incentive or that reward. And basically, it's most undermining because it's perceived as controlling. That if you have this preset, tangible, predetermined reward, that that you can't get unless you meet these criteria, you know, you're kind of taking away that sense of autonomy. And so it feels more controlling. So that doesn't work so well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So another thing that can make rewards seem more controlling, or a condition in which they can undermine intrinsic motivation more, is when the rewards are more arbitrary. So like a common example is like the book it program, where where you can get pizza for reading books. Well, what does pizza have to do with reading? Nothing. Right. So it kind of sends this message of, I really have to bribe you with pizza to get you to do this miserable task of reading something. And so that can undermine intrinsic motivation that way. On the other hand, if the reward is connected, so like if I got a book for reading, then it sends a message that, oh, reading is something worth doing. It's a way to be able to get this reward that allows me to do it more. And so it sends a different kind of message.
Which is good. It's more beneficial if we have that connection there. Another key thing, if we're looking at trying to foster intrinsic motivation, is even if we have rewards, not to overemphasize the rewards. So, have the rewards there, have that be an incentive for some students, but don't make a huge deal of it, kind of don't overemphasize those rewards. And this was a difference that I definitely saw going back to my story with my cross country coaches. The first coach was really, again, more focused on kind of holistic, running for lifelong running, loving to run. And we didn't really have a whole bunch of even public praise when we do well. It was celebrated, but we just kind of move on and see how we could do better in the future. My second cross country coach was so focused on that position, what position that you would finish that race in to get the score, as a team to do well, that kind of tended to override everything else. And so it was really setting up this condition for our intrinsic motivation to fall because there was so much emphasis on that reward or that placement.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. So, and personally, I think like the biggest problem isn't the presence of rewards in education, but the absence of the other stuff, the stuff that focuses on developing intrinsic motivation. The bringing about the inherent satisfaction, certain stuff, the developing sense of autonomy, competence, relatedness, and all that good stuff. And your cross country example is a really good example of that. So there were rewards there. You can get that first place ribbon or whatever. But with your first coach, those things were, they're still important, but they're more in the background. And it was the other stuff that was in the foreground. And it sounds like with your other coach, it flipped. And that's the problem. And we see that in education sometimes too, when the rewards become the main thing and the main motivator, and all the talk is about the grades, some sort of rewards and punishments and all that, then it's like that second coach. And we need to bring forward and really emphasize the intrinsic motivation stuff. And I think that's really critical.
Yep, I agree. So another one of the questions, thinking about questions that we often kind of get asked or or kind of try to answer about in self-determination theory and intrinsic motivation, the question often comes up, so do schools motivate or control? if we're thinking about this in a way that's an either or, do schools motivate or control? The answer really is yes. They do both. I mean, and I think that we can see schools as a really nice example of places that both can motivate but also control. Because we have uh, just the grading system that we do have most typically in most schools in the United States, at least. Those grades are an extrinsic incentive that can foster that extrinsic motivation if we're only focused on grades. But at the same time, teachers can do lots to motivate intrinsic motivation, or to increase intrinsic motivation within their classrooms. If a lot of the focus, though, is on controlling students and sometimes even controlling student behavior in classes instead of focusing on that motivation, then we can see, some issues come out of that. But essentially, we do see both elements of motivation and control within school environments.
Yeah, so both Cassie and I would probably agree that there's a lot of control efforts that go on in education, and probably more so than needs to be. And we're always encouraging teachers and schools to, it's harder, but there's more benefits long term to move more towards this focus on motivating instead of just controlling.
Mhm.
um, but that said, another question that often comes up is like, yeah, but come on, isn't it idealistic to expect students to be intrinsically motivated all the time? And the answer is like, yes, absolutely. Yeah, you
Yes.
cannot expect students to just always be intrinsically motivated.
Mhm.
Um, and self determination theory recognizes this, and has revised the theory and addressed this. And so we thought we would talk about this. And
Mhm.
I'm going to share my screen here. So we have a figure here um, that represents um, kind of the revised self-determination theory model. So instead of just thinking about in terms of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, that you can divide extrinsic motivation into these different types that become increasingly more internal. And in fact, they even divide it so that there's these first two types of extrinsic motivation that are seen as representing a form of controlled motivation. And these other two are seen as part of autonomous motivation along with intrinsic motivation. And all the same benefits that we talked about for intrinsic motivation, they apply to these other more autonomous forms of extrinsic motivation as well. Um, and so thought we'd talk about these a little bit. So Cassie, what's external regulation?
Yeah, so external regulation is basically when we're doing a task completely for that external reward. Um, to some extent, that's kind of controlling our motivation in that way. So if we're using, running as an example, let's say that it was like your mom or your dad that kind of forced you into running cross country, or, if you were under some, I've never heard of this situation, but in some situation where you were running in high school to get paid and only to get paid, you didn't really enjoy it at all. It was either because your parents were making you do it or you're getting paid. That would be external regulation. And so, basically completely um, going off of that reward.
Yeah, so introjection is doing it out of like social pressure or guilt. So now I might go running because I feel this, intense peer pressure to go and run. Or it might be, again, I might have these controlling fitness parents, um, and they just, put a tremendous amount of guilt on me. And so I run just to not disappoint my parents. And that would be this introjection.
Yep. And then identification is when we start seeing some value out of the task, and that impacting our motivation. So it might be if I run because I know that it will help keep me healthy. I run because I know that when I run, it helps my stress levels. Those types of things would be examples of identification, the identification stage of this model.
And then integration would be when it becomes part of my identity. And so now, I think of myself as a runner, and in a habit, I just get up and I go running. And so it might not necessarily be like it's always just inherently satisfying to get going out the door, but it's part of my identity. It's just what I do. And so, I do that on this regular basis.
Yep. And then finally, intrinsic motivation would be like if you just really love running and you run only because you love it. If you start running and you get into kind of that sense of flow where the time just passes. I remember when we would do two a day sometimes and we'd have our first practice at 6:30 in the morning. I think it also helped because we were kind of tired, but those were some of the times that I felt like I had the most intrinsic motivation to run. The smell, the morning smell of the dew and everything. It was a nice. There were just you know, a few flashing moments in my history of running that I would say that I really hit that intrinsic motivation for running.
Yeah. And, in the real world, often our motivation is complex and it can be a combination of a number of these things. So, maybe I run, maybe partly it is because of, this peer pressure. I don't want to let my running group down. But
Mhm,
also, I see the real value in running. It's good for my health, it's good for my mental well-being.
mhm,
It's part of my habit and identity to a degree. And there are those moments when, it is just sort of this flow, inherently satisfying thing. And so when it comes to school, when, we're focusing on what we're going to try to motivate rather than just control students, it doesn't always have to be that extreme of intrinsic motivation where our students are just inherently enjoying whatever they do. It can be these other forms of autonomous motivation too, like where we help them see the value that comes
mhm,
from learning.
mhm,
And even if it's not always fun, no, but there's inherent worth and value in learning this content, developing these skills, making it through school and into college and into a career. And hopefully, we can also help them start to develop an identity as a student, as
mhm,
someone who is a learner and can be successful in the academic environment. And those are things that are more realistic.
mhm,
And what we would say is, focus on those things. um, and there might be some of this external regulation and introjection, but those are the things we would hope would be more in the background rather than the drivers. um, and in fact, one of the thoughts that just came to mind is, remember, there's a lot of research on school reform, and
mhm,
there's different models of school reform. And like the US and most of the world right now are in these big obsession with accountability. Like the way we're going to improve schools is by holding teachers accountable for student performance. And that's, we'll have all these proficiency tests and that, and rate and grade schools on that. So, if you think about, okay, where does that fit on there? Well, it's more on this controlled motivation side, the external regulation, interjection, and that. Another approach to improving schools is a focus on autonomy. So, providing teachers with more choice and ownership in the system, and more responsibilities like that, and more collaboration opportunities, um, and more time to do things like some of the planning and all that. And what they find is that overall, for long-term whole system change, it's that autonomy focus is much more successful than the control focus. So if you look at country, like especially like Finland is like the the um, the best example, because that's what, they spent 30 years creating an autonomous system, and there's more to it as well, but there's a lot of it is this, they create this real autonomous system in that. um, and even without their country focusing on proficiency tests or anything like that, they rose to be one of the best
mhm,
in the nation, with often among the least number of instruction hours. It's not like, in some of the Asian countries where they have school and then they have, private tutors, and then they have Saturday school, and they have more school days in school year. Like Finland just does what they do well, and succeeds through this autonomous model. So, all right, let me unshare my screen.
Sounds good. Yeah, I like that model because I feel like a lot of times when you talk to people who are not in the motivation research area, it is this perception that it's either extrinsic or intrinsic motivation. And seeing it as kind of a spectrum, I think is a really helpful thing to recognize, we can be moving students up and that's still beneficial, even if they are not going to leave our classes, absolutely loving, math or whatever it is that we are teaching. So one of the other questions that we often, ask and kind of think about is how do we foster interest? So it's a little, interest being a little bit different than intrinsic motivation. But interest, how do we get our students interested in the material we're teaching? How do we kind of try to prevent them from being bored? Um, there's a whole line of research in interest theory. It's actually called interest theory. But we're going to kind of go over the four basic big things that you can do to foster interest in classrooms.
Yeah. So one of the things that you can really focus on is establishing relevance. So it seems like one of the keys to helping students develop an interest in the course and in the content is if they can see that it's relevant to their lives and things they care about. Um, and again, one of our future sessions will be about transformative experience theory, which is all about this, how can you really establish relevance and make the learning transformative for students? But that's one of the big things. Involvement is the next one. Do you want to talk about that one?
Yep. So involvement is another big thing. And involvement is basically referring to involving students in their own learning, kind of thinking about this as active learning broadly. So having, activities or discussions or ways that students can interact with that content in a way that again, hopefully is relevant based on what Kevin was just saying before, but also gives them that ability to be the actors essentially, and so that they are the ones that are constructing that knowledge. So that involvement component can really help increase interest. Another one is personal meaning.
Yeah, so when students find the content personally meaningful, then they're much more interested. This one obviously overlaps with relevance. That relevance is often a way of establishing meaning. But so often students don't see what they're learning as meaningful. And so helping them see that this content or this skill is meaningful, again, greatly increases their interest in it. And then finally, all right,
And
passion and excitement. Yeah.
yes, passion and excitement. And this is honestly more coming from a teacher initiated element. But if, trying to convey the passion that you feel for the things that you teach in an exciting way, that this idea of presenting it with passion, and teacher passion is related in the research to all sorts of really beneficial outcomes. If you have a passionate teacher, those are often the ones that we remember, for a long time. But that passion and enthusiasm and excitement is contagious. And so often that's something that can increase interest in students is by modeling and showing your own interest in that content. So hopefully with passion and enthusiasm.
And then there's also a number of kind of specific strategies that researchers have found that foster interest. Some of these things are like novelty. So just when we learn things that are new and different, that tends to capture our interest. Or relatedly, what we sometimes refer to as a hole in a schema. So that means when you know about something and then you find out that there's a piece of knowledge that you're missing about that thing, like, oh, you know all about this, but did you know? Like that captures our interest. We want to fill in that gap in our knowledge. Putting things in a narrative context. By the way, this is one of my big gripes about the textbooks. It's like Cassie and I were always teaching this educational psychology stuff, and there's these educational psychology textbooks, and then they're often all written in a way that defies all the principles of educational psychology in there, right? Because is there anything more boring to read than a textbook? and part of this is because it's not in narrative form, whereas narrative, we like to this unfolding of a story. And that, by the way, so I actually wrote my own non-textbook for my students and for the ed psych classes that is more narrative, a bunch of stories to try to make it more interesting. So and then related to this, there's this whole idea of gamification. Do you want to talk about that, Cassie?
Yeah, so gamification is this idea that we take the content, or we take the even the structure of the class, and basically turn it into being kind of similar to a game. So I have a colleague who is teaching community college, and she took her whole development, so human development class, and she has like different tracks that students can pursue to reach different achievements in these different areas. And the idea, and she presents them with a lot of different options. And so the idea is that students can choose to go on these different tracks or take on these different kind of missions to reach accomplishments. And it's those accomplishments that are basically for point value that will add up to the grades in the course. But kind of, looking at it and the structure of the class, not just the content of the class in a gamified way, but the structure of the class actually kind of mirroring a gaming system. And so sometimes that can just, even the structure, changing the structure can increase the intrinsic motivation students would have for that class, that bleeds over to the content as well. Or hopefully we hope that it bleeds over to the content.
Yes, yes. And there is some controversy around this because some people look at it like, well, but by gamifying it, are you bringing in these extrinsic rewards and that and again, it depends on how it's done, and that if it's done in a way where students see like the whole game as part of the learning process, and that it's supporting them rather than then it doesn't undermine the intrinsic motivation. But if they see it as like, oh, this teacher is setting up this whole game system just to try to manipulate me and get me to try to do this stuff, then yes,
Then it wouldn't be good.
then it wouldn't be, so again, it's there aren't always these simple answers, but the overall, we want to try to help the students find interest in both what they're doing in the moment and in the broader content, and so using that gamification stuff to kind of do both. So yeah, and I think that's it for this vlog. So one of the big takeaways is that as motivation researchers, we really do place emphasis on more of these internal forms of motivation. And it's not that external ones like extrinsic motivation is bad and should be completely removed, but it's more that those are often there already. It's kind of like we said with the performance and mastery goals, often like the performance stuff is already there, and what we need to think about and focus on is developing the mastery stuff, or now in this case the intrinsic stuff. So bringing in the things that will help students have a sense of autonomy and competence and relatedness, see the satisfaction in it, perk their interest and curiosity and all those sort of things, and focus on those, because that those internal forms of motivation, they have such nice long-term benefits. So,
Yep.
all right, where are you, Cassie?
I am on the North Fork of the Gunnison River by Paonia, Colorado. We had a lovely trip there it's been like 3 or 4 years now, but it was a beautiful river and a sunny day, which was a different season than where you are.
Yes, I'm in the snow. So yeah, so this picture was taken from earlier this week where I snuck off to do some skiing, and so this is up in Rocky Mountain National Park. And so this particular area, it's called the Banana Bowl. So if you go to the Bear Lake trailhead and you take the Flat Top Mountain Trail and then you kind of veer right, it's on the north side of Flat Top Mountain is a big open bowl, and one of the nice places to go backcountry skiing. So
It looks
yeah,
like you had a beautiful day for it
yeah,
as well.
beautiful day. So all right, well, Thank you for listening to our vlog, and we will see you in our next one.
Yep, we'll be headed on to the next motivation theory.
All right.
Have a good one.
See
Thank
you.
you.